Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been on everyone's mind lately. That new bat coronavirus with, the one with the potential to jump to humans.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that all over the news.
Yeah.
It's hard not to feel a little anxious with everything we've been through the past few years.
Exactly. It's like, oh no, not again. And
Not
this
again.
time it feels different, somehow heavier, maybe because we're also dealing with the after effects of the pandemic. Like, everyone's just exhausted.
Yeah, that exhaustion is real, and it's actually a key theme in a lot of the sources we're looking at today. They call it moral fatigue.
Moral fatigue.
Definitely.
Sounds intense. Is it like being tired of doing the right thing?
In a way, yeah. It's this feeling of depletion after years of making tough choices
Yeah.
for the greater good, like masking social distancing, all the sacrifices.
I can definitely relate to that feeling. It's like we used up all our willpower during the pandemic, and now this new threat emerges. And it's not just the fatigue, it's this specific virus that's triggering a whole other level of anxiety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources call it anticipatory anxiety, that fear of what might happen.
Right. It's not just about this one virus, but the fear of endless new variants emerging. Like, will it ever end?
It's a valid fear. And, one thing that surprised me in the research was how this new coronavirus is different from COVID-19 in terms of vaccine development.
Oh, really? I thought we had made so much progress with the mRNA vaccines.
We did, and those were incredibly effective against COVID. But this bat coronavirus family is different. The research suggests that scientists are exploring new types of vaccines, like protein subunit vaccines, to target this family more effectively.
So even the good news comes with this but attached. No wonder people are feeling uneasy. It's like our past victories aren't as reassuring now.
That's a great way to put it. And this uncertainty, this what if it happens again feeling, really impacts our mental health in a way that goes beyond, your typical flu season worries.
I can see that. It brings up those deep-seated fears, loss of control, uncertainty about the future, and maybe even a sense of betrayal, like the systems that are supposed to protect us failed us.
That's a profound point. Because after going through so much with COVID, there's less trust this time around, right? Less faith that things will be handled effectively.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like, the foundation of our trust was shaken. And that makes me think about something that came up in the sources, the role of public health messaging in all of this.
Absolutely. Because how this information is communicated can make all the difference. In the past, we've seen how inconsistent messaging or downplaying the risks can just make things worse, fuel the anxiety and erode trust.
Oh, yeah. Remember the early days of COVID, the confusion about masks, the constantly changing guidelines? It felt like nobody knew what was going on.
Exactly. And that kind of uncertainty can be paralyzing. So the question becomes, what should effective public health communication look like in this situation?
That's a million-dollar question. Our sources point to a few key elements: transparency, consistency, and empathy. It's not just about stating the facts, but acknowledging people's fears, validating their concerns, and providing clear, actionable steps they can take.
You got it. It's more about, we see your fear, and here's what we're doing about it, rather than just, don't panic.
Okay, so like those countries that had really clear, consistent messaging around hand washing and masks during COVID, that seems like a good model.
It is. It shows how much psychology is interwoven with public health. It's not just about the virus itself, it's how we perceive the threat and how that perception is shaped by the information we receive.
That's fascinating. It makes the role of public health officials even more important. They're not just battling the virus, they're battling the fears surrounding it.
Exactly. And that battle is just as crucial, because if people lose hope, if they lose trust, or they become paralyzed by fear, it becomes almost impossible to implement effective public health measures.
It's like we need both the science and the psychology to work together to overcome these threats. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Anxieties, fatigue, the importance of messaging. I think this sets the stage for the rest of our deep dive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, I think it's important to focus on what we can control, how individuals can build resilience in the face of all this uncertainty.
Okay, so for everyone listening, let's take a deep breath and shift gears now. We're going to dive into those individual coping strategies and explore how to navigate this new landscape in a way that feels empowering rather than overwhelming. Ready to keep going?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've talked about how this news is hitting us differently on a psychological level. But before we spiral, let's talk about what we can do. I know our sources mentioned coping mechanisms. Can we break those down a bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that there are two main approaches people tend to take: information seeking and avoidance. And what's interesting is The effectiveness of each really depends on your personality and your past experiences.
Wait, so what worked for me during COVID might not be the best strategy now. That's pretty interesting.
Exactly. For example, if someone found comfort in meticulously tracking data during the pandemic, that same level of information seeking now could actually increase anxiety, given all the unknowns with this virus.
That makes sense. But what about those who just shut down any news they find distressing? Isn't that harmful too?
Avoidance can be a healthy short-term way to protect yourself. But the problem is, as our sources point out, prolonged avoidance can make you feel less prepared and ultimately more vulnerable in the long run. It's like trying to ignore a storm while it's brewing right outside your door.
So how do we find that balance between staying informed and not getting sucked into a vortex of anxiety?
The key is mindful information consumption. Choose a few reliable sources. Set specific times to check in. And most importantly, focus on actionable information. What steps can you actually take?
Okay, that's actually helpful advice. But what about the social aspect of all this? Our sources touched on how this news impacts our behavior, right?
They did. And this is where those individual coping mechanisms we talked about can really play out in our interactions. For instance, someone who's really into information seeking might become the alarm bell of their friend group, constantly sharing the latest scary headlines.
Oh yeah, I know that person. Always forwarding those doom and gloom articles. But what about the opposite? Wouldn't someone who avoids information become more isolated as things potentially get more serious?
It's definitely a risk. The sources highlight how fear can lead to social withdrawal, which ironically can fuel even more anxiety as we feel less connected and supported. It's a bit of a vicious cycle.
So what's the solution? How do we stay connected and mentally healthy when faced with a potential threat like this? Because honestly, that fear of isolation can be almost as bad as the virus itself.
You've hit on a crucial point.
Yeah.
The need for healthy social connection is absolutely paramount during times like these. It's about finding that sweet spot between acknowledging the risks and maintaining a sense of normalcy. So maybe that means smaller gatherings with trusted friends, open and honest conversations about anxieties, or even shared activities that bring joy and distraction.
So it's like we need to be each other's support system without becoming each other's source of panic, which sounds tricky but really important.
Exactly. And this is where those larger resilience strategies come into play, the ones that go beyond individual coping. Because frankly, facing these recurring threats isn't sustainable on willpower alone. We need systems in place that support us long term.
I'm listening. What do those resilience systems look like?
Well, on a societal level, it means strengthening public health infrastructure, investing in research for things like broad-spectrum antivirals, and increasing global cooperation. It's about acknowledging that this isn't a one-time thing, but a new reality we need to be prepared for.
That sounds expensive and complex. But I guess the alternative, being caught off guard every time a new virus pops up, is a lot worse, right?
Exactly. And then on a personal level, it's about building those habits that protect us from chronic stress. Things like sleep hygiene exercise and mindfulness practices that strengthen our overall resilience.
So it's not just about getting through each individual threat. It's about creating a stronger foundation so we can weather any storm no matter what form it takes.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive one. We can advocate for better pandemic preparedness policies. We can support research into new antiviral treatments. We can even learn more about epidemiology so we understand these threats better.
I like that. Instead of feeling helpless, we become active participants in building a more resilient future. But I have to admit, it's hard to shake this feeling that it's all on us now. Individuals figuring it out while the larger systems lag behind.
It's a valid concern, and it highlights the need for both individual and collective action. We need to hold our leaders accountable for prioritizing pandemic preparedness, while simultaneously equipping ourselves with the tools to navigate this new landscape.
So it's a two-pronged approach, inner resilience and pushing for outer systems change. And honestly, that feels a lot more empowering than just waiting for the next shoe to drop.
That's the key, and that's the message I want to leave everyone with. This isn't about giving in to fear. It's about recognizing our own agency, both individually and collectively. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the human capacity for incredible resilience.
That's really well said. And for our listeners, think about this. What are some specific actions you can take, both in your daily life and in your community, to cultivate that sense of grounded resilience? It's a question worth considering as we move into the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we've talked about navigating this fear with caution, being mindful of the information we consume, and even how our own coping styles play into all of this. But now I want to zoom out a bit and tackle that big looming question. How do we build resilience, both personally and as a society, in a world where these kinds of threats might become more frequent?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And
Mm.
it requires us to really shift our perspective.
Mm.
Because, if we're constantly reacting to every new threat, and just lurching from one crisis to the next, we're going to burn out both individually and collectively.
Yeah, I can already feel that. And this is just one potential virus we're talking about. So what's the alternative? How do we shift from that reactive mode to a more proactive, resilient way of being?
Well, I think on a societal level, it starts with acknowledging that pandemic preparedness is no longer a nice to have. It's essential. It's fundamental. Our sources touch on this, but I think it needs even more emphasis. We need to invest in public health infrastructure the same way we invest in, national defense. Because honestly, these kinds of threats can be just as destabilizing to our world.
That's a powerful comparison. It really makes you realize how much we prioritize reacting to those immediate threats like military conflicts, but often neglect those slower burning but equally devastating threats like pandemic.
Exactly. And it's not just about money. It's about political will, global cooperation, and a recognition that our interconnectedness makes us all vulnerable. So investing in early detection systems, in robust research for broad-spectrum antivirals, strengthening healthcare systems globally, these aren't just nice-to-haves. They're essential for our collective survival.
It sounds daunting, but also in a way hopeful. Like they're concrete steps we can take as individuals advocating for change and as a global community working together.
That's the spirit. And while those big systemic changes are so crucial, they can take time. So in the meantime, we also need to cultivate personal resilience. Those inner resources that help us weather the storm, no matter what form it takes.
That makes a lot of sense. We can't just sit around and wait for the world to become this perfectly resilient place. We have to build that resilience within ourselves as well. So what are some practical strategies for doing that?
Well, our sources mentioned some great ones: prioritizing sleep, regular exercise, mindful eating, and all those foundational practices that support both physical and mental well-being. But I think it goes deeper than that. It's about cultivating a mindset that embraces uncertainty instead of fearing it.
Oh, that's a tough one. How do we do that? Because right now, uncertainty feels pretty scary.
It's about recognizing that uncertainty is simply a part of life. Always has been, always will be. The pandemic just kind of amplified that reality. So instead of trying to control everything, which is impossible, we focus on what we can control.
Yeah.
Our responses, our choices, our attitudes.
So it's about accepting that we can't predict the future, but we can prepare for a range of possibilities and build the skills to adapt to whatever comes our way.
Exactly. It's about getting comfortable with discomfort. Knowing that we can handle challenges even if they're unexpected. And it's about having a toolkit of coping mechanisms. Mindfulness, stress reduction techniques, strong social connections. Things we can draw on when things inevitably get tough.
It's like building an emotional immune system, right? Just as important as our physical one.
I love that analogy.
Oh,
Because just like our physical immune system needs to be exposed to a variety of challenges to become stronger, our emotional resilience also needs to be tested and strengthened over time. And frankly, facing these ongoing threats, as daunting as they are, can actually be opportunities for that kind of growth.
that's a reframing I hadn't considered before. Instead of seeing these threats as things to just fear and endure, we can also see them as chances to build our resilience, to become more adaptable, to learn and grow as individuals and as a society.
Exactly. It's not about minimizing the very real risks and challenges, but about recognizing that we have the capacity to not just survive, but to thrive in a world with increased uncertainty. And that, to me, is where true hope lies. Not some naive hope that everything will be easy, but a grounded hope that we have the inner and outer resources to face whatever comes our way.
That's such a powerful message, and one that I think we all need to hear right now. So for everyone listening, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to walk away with this. Building resilience isn't about becoming invincible. It's about embracing the reality of uncertainty and equipping ourselves with the tools, both internal and external, to navigate it with courage, compassion, and a sense of agency.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And remember, you're not alone in this journey. We're all in this together, facing these challenges and discovering our collective capacity for resilience.
And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a heavy topic, but I hope you've come away with some valuable insights, some practical tools, and maybe even a renewed sense of hope. Remember, stay curious, stay connected, and stay resilient.